Welcome, everybody. I'll be covering WinGet configuration today, so hopefully you're in the right room. If you're not, feel free to sneak out. I plan on doing this a lot like I did last year. I'm very interested in getting your feedback. If you've got any questions, feel free to interrupt me just by raising your hand. I'm optimizing a little bit for some of the network challenges we've had. When you're pulling a lot of data down with modules, we started having some performance things. I did some measurements earlier. Doesn't run quite as fast as I'd like. So first off, thanks for our sponsors. A little bit about me. I've done a lot of work in IT. I started out learning computer science in 1983, back in the good old days of assembly and BASIC, sort of right before the IBM clone wars all started. Held a bunch of different positions: software engineer, infrastructure, databases, architecture. Basically, whatever skill I didn't have, that seemed to be the next job I got. This was pretty exciting for me to be able to work on the Windows Package Manager since Microsoft hadn't had one. And it's been a fantastic ride. But my real goal and my real passion has been configuration management and really kind of getting rid of a lot of that complexity. So WinGet configuration could not have existed without a reasonably stable package manager. And we were releasing support for dependencies in WinGet 1.6. That was really the milestone that allowed us to start looking at configuration management. And I think of this as more of configuration as code. I would say more so than infrastructure. But when you start looking at the world of appliances that are software-based and software-designed data centers, things from other companies, there's a little bit more blending going on. And with the capabilities of PowerShell desired state configuration, you can pretty much configure anything and get it to do what you want it to do. We wanted to have a declarative file, so we picked YAML primarily because that's what WinGet was already using for manifest. There's a perception it's a little easier to read as a human than dealing with kind of all the curly braces of JSON. But rather than getting into those debates, we just picked the one that we had already been going on. And we built this first offering on top of PowerShell DSC v2 because that was what was stable. That's where kind of most of the activity was. But I talked with several folks on the PowerShell team and others. I heard quite a bit ahead of time. We already knew we were going for DSC v3. So what I'm covering today is primarily how to build a configuration file, how to work with where we are today. I'm going to call out the rough edges and the challenges that you're likely to encounter. Then I'll talk a little bit more about the future with v3. So when it comes to building and testing configurations, I would recommend highly start with some samples. We've got several that we've put into DevHome. I'll have some links that are in the presentation later for where you can go find some. I recommend testing in the Windows Sandbox because it's ephemeral. Not everything works there. There's some challenges. It's limited to a 50 gig disk volume. So if you're trying to install something like Visual Studio or IS, that may not be a good fit. In that case, try with a virtual machine, so that you can make sure that you're actually able to get everything in there. I see, especially with developer scenarios, a lot of people getting false positives on missing dependencies. I don't know that that's as big a challenge for this crowd since you're maintaining infrastructure typically and you're doing a lot more automation and you're probably actually a little more well-versed in DSC than the developer audience. But the value I see here is if you understand WinGet configuration and WinGet as a package manager, that's going to be the only way you're going to allow your enterprise customers to use this technology. So really for me to be here is really understanding your needs and how I'm going to unblock you so that your developers can take advantage of these products. I don't know how many of you were at Build or have seen any of the presentations, but with the DevHome experience in Windows, we've announced environments. This allows you to go in and build and connect and configure Hyper-V VMs. We've done work with adding WSL that's in Canary. We've done work with Windows Sandbox, and it's an upgraded one that is a little more flexible that you can expand the volume, and there's some great features that are coming there. It also has a generate configuration file function that I'll show you. And the kind of the last reminder when you're testing, a lot of times when you've got multiple layers of abstraction, you're not actually getting all of the verbose feedback and output that you want for what's going on. And I'll show you some examples. Since it's just calling Invoke-DSC resource under the hood, sometimes that's a great place to go to try to troubleshoot why a configuration is not behaving. So last year I talked about kind of living in a world of PowerShell and trying to use WinGet only in PowerShell context regularly. I've done that. It's still horrible. when I go into Windows Sandbox, and this screenshot is kind of me showing you that WinGet is not installed, but I can use Windows PowerShell to get the client PowerShell module for WinGet. I can then call repair WinGet package manager to pull that down and get WinGet installed. Then I can use install WinGet package to get PowerShell 7 so that I can finally get to the point that I can use the WinGet configuration. So this is all the steps I have to go through to get a pure PowerShell WinGet configuration set up in a sandbox where it's not there. I feel your pain. I'm having to go through these same things myself. And you'll also see things like you do a fresh install of WinGet on Windows 11. You end up with version 1.2. You can't install anything in the Microsoft Store. You can't upgrade WinGet with it. You're kind of in a broken state. And in the enterprise, if you've disabled automatic updates from the store, now there's no way the user is going to get updated. We do have some samples that are documented at Microsoft Learn for how you can manually do that. We're going to be releasing WinGet 1.8 tonight or tomorrow morning. The team is working on that right now. That includes the ability to download applications from the Microsoft Store, including their dependencies and their licenses. That's been a long time coming. It's another one of those building blocks towards getting more capability and more control. And we'll talk a little bit more about the governance scenarios a little bit later as well. So as I mentioned earlier, DevHome is kind of your easy button. I'm going to try to get through the slides and then I'll do some demo and some questions. So this is the boring part. So there's an option on there. You'll see set up the local machine. It allows you to go through, pick a GitHub repository or multiples if you want to clone them. If they have configuration files detected, it'll allow you to run them at the end. You have a shopping cart type experience where you can add the apps and packages that you want. And then when you're done, you can either apply that to that device or you can click generate configuration and it will spit out a YAML file with what you've selected. There are still plenty of sharp edges though. One of the first things we ran into was me trying to figure out how to enable the Windows Sandbox using the Windows optional features. And of course, WinGet is packaged. I can still bring PowerShell 7 hosting along with me. I can use Invoke-DSC resource. And then immediately when it calls the actual module that's calling the DISM APIs, it fails. So the only way around that is to run unpackaged PowerShell, meaning either the XE or the MSI. And then from there, you're able to call it where you're not in that package context and it will be able to do it. And I've documented that at DevHome as the workaround for dealing with these packaged contexts. The next one is system context. How many of you work in system context? That's about what I expected. So I'm sure many of you are aware you can't install things for user in system context without some form of impersonation. And anything that's MSIX based, they don't really install per user or per device the way you would think. It's a slightly different life cycle. And in the system context, what you're actually doing in that case is that's where the system thinks the files have been laid down or pre-provisioned. When the user logs in for the first time, MSIX engine will basically stand up. It will create the virtual entries for the application for that user, and then they're able to run it, but it runs in a container, which is where we see some of those challenges reaching out. And then the last one I would say that's probably the most obvious one is discoverability. How many of you know every single DSC resource out there? Exactly. How many of you know that there's a DSC resource for Visual Studio Code? I can let you know there is one. It does work. It hasn't been touched in several years. Open source, community maintained. We're probably going to have to find a way to partner with them and make an official one, or better yet, go to the Visual Studio Code team and have them go ahead and build via DSC V3 support directly into VS Code. I think what we're going to do, honestly, is try to leapfrog ahead a little bit and go for DSC V3, because now we don't have to pull down the extra PowerShell modules, but we still want to be able to use the ones that are there. So for all of the products in Windows that we're doing on the developer side, PowerToys, Windows Terminal, DevHome, WinGet, the WSL settings, I'm working with all of those other teams to do all of those reference implementations open source. So you'll be able to see, how do we recommend you do a configuration when you're talking to files versus the registry versus APIs? And even for WinGet, we have a notion of administrator-only settings versus user settings. And so we're dealing with a lot of that complexity. And when I get into DevHome, I'll show you some of the other fun challenges that we're looking at next. So if you want to take a screenshot of the links, feel free. This is basically just kind of high-level product documentation, where we're putting the samples in DevHome. You'll see a link to a presentation done by Anthony in DevDev where he covers building WinGet configurations and some work they've done with Copilot inside Visual Studio. Actually generates the nodes for you in the configuration. And then the last link is the DSC project that we've open sourced at GitHub. And that's where we're open sourcing some of the modules that we've created to unblock some things. There wasn't anything for pip or for NPM. There wasn't anything for Git. So we've built those to bootstrap them. They'll probably end up going back to the DSC community. But before we hand those over, we want to make sure they're in good working order and that we build everything correctly to the standards of the community. So my last trick is I'll search for the schema at GitHub, and you'll see there's nearly 400 references. That was as of a few minutes ago. This is another great place to go and look, and I've got some links for some individuals that have been building some sample configurations and some of the things we've been doing to give you more work to build on top of. So as I talked about earlier, let me see if I can minimize this. It's just calling Invoke-DSC resource under the hood. So this example, I just used the test method for what it takes to see whether or not the Windows Sandbox is enabled. I do have it enabled on my system, but you'll see I have to have administrative permissions to be able to test the state of it. So if I go ahead and do run as administrator, accept the UAC, hopefully I still have the same thing in my buffer. Of course not. So this should come back and it should tell me that it's true, that I have the disposable client VM service enabled. The next thing I'll show you, I can't do this one in PowerShell yet because I'm going to use a URL to start a configuration for the sandbox. I don't know if that's going to finish before we're done talking, but hopefully it will. So in the WinGet CLI, I can pass a URL to a configuration file. We haven't got that built into the PowerShell module yet, but that is coming shortly. This has been one of the top asks. We've also had people that are wanting to use this for things like .files. So they want to just give us a GitHub URL to their project and have us go discover the configuration file and just automatically run that configuration file directly, since Windows doesn't ship with Git pre-installed like Linux distros and like Macs do. So big scary warning. You'll notice the new red text that shows that something was truncated. We've noticed some things where people were passing VT sequences and other interesting things to kind of modify the output. So now those things get blocked in validation. And if it's something really long, like all of the lovely scripting work that gets the Windows Sandbox bootstrapped, we're going to truncate that and recommend that you go look at the file directly, just so you know what you're running. So while this is up and going, it's essentially going to try to get WinGet installed in the Windows Sandbox, and I'll go ahead and show you that configuration file now. So this is just a forward link. The short URL points to the YAML file. And you'll see with the sandbox, the interesting bits is all of the stuff here that's kind of related to what's going on. So, you know, it's just YAML. The interesting thing in the sandbox, you're running as the administrator by default in that context. So packages like Spotify and Postman are not going to work in Windows Sandbox at this point because they have to be done in user context. That's another common thing that we see with mixed elevation. In DevHome, when you're running a configuration, we've added some extra bits in there so that we can actually determine if you're elevated or if you're not elevated. If you're not elevated, you get a single UAC, and it will run things not elevated unless they're decorated that way. So as I talked about DevHome, if I go into, let me cancel out of this and start over for you. So if I go to set up my local machine, this is kind of the default flow. If I want to, I can pick a repository, and I'm going to add the one for WinGet CLI just as an example. I'll add that one. I'll go next. I'm just going to add a couple of applications. This would be the same kind of an experience you have through WinGet Search. You can put whatever you want in there. When you get to the next screen, you've got the option of generating a configuration file, or you can agree and set it up. I'm just going to do generate a configuration file. So you can see what was generated. You can see this top resource is using WinGet to install Visual Studio. The second one is installing Notepad. And then after that, you'll notice since I had done the choice to do cloning operation, DevHome goes ahead and adds the requirement for Git as a dependency prior to cloning that repository. So this is another nice way to get some examples of generating configuration files so that you've got something to start with. The next question we always get is, how am I going to go from what's on my local device into a configuration file? I know this was asked earlier in Steve Lee's presentation on DSC V3. For WinGet, we have an experimental feature. Right now, it's only available in the CLI. And you'll see this really long line here. This is our first building block. What we're doing here is we are taking the package ID for the package that is specified. In this case, I'm just using the Microsoft App Installer, which is actually what WinGet is shipped in. You'll see the module I'm specifying is the WinGet-DSC module, and the resource I'm looking for here is the user settings, and then I'm just outputting it to a user setting file. I'm not going to run it. I've already got one. If I run it again, it will just continue appending. So the idea is this is a building block that you can go in. If you had resources and you knew what they were, you could just kind of continue building up and piping this kind of output out to get a file generated. So if I open up user settings, you'll see that it knew that it needed to install the app installer. And then the next one is the user settings. I'll get your question in just a second. And you'll see that I've got a few experimental features enabled, and I've got the rainbow progress bar. This was not something that I generated by hand. This is essentially WinGet newing up an instance of that class and then getting each one of the properties back out of it. There was a question in the back? Oh, thank you. That a little better? Sorry about that. It doesn't remember the settings for me. So, like I said, this is a building block that we're working on. The goal is to be able to actually generate a configuration file that matches the state of your machine, but there are some really hard challenges in there. I call them quasi-intractable because we don't have anything today that's going to solve some of these problems, but we know we can build solutions to them. I'm going to give you kind of my favorite current example is for Xbox game development. There's a game developer kit. You can install that all by itself and it will install, but it won't function unless you've installed Visual Studio and you've installed the right workload ahead of time. Now, one of the challenges with that was you can call repair and it will fix it, but there was no repair command. So we've added that to WinGet. WinGet now has the ability to try to repair MSI or MSIX packages, but it does depend on them having the implementation in their installers to be able to do that. And when I go to export, it's pretty easy for me to do, WinGet list and map everything that we know of in any configured source. So I could generate all of the configuration file syntax that'll install all the applications, but I can't guarantee that I'm going to get them in the right order. And lots of our applications have dependencies on .NET Runtime, on VC libraries, and without having some place to kind of go get that information, we have no way to know what the dependencies are. So we've got a few ideas. We'll probably start some discussions and see what you think about this. My thinking is possibly an interface related to DSC V3, where any declared or implicit dependencies can be specified, so that WinGet can get that information, or whatever orchestrator you want to use can get that information out of it. The other big challenge is all of the Windows settings, and there are a ton of them. So we're building V2 modules to cover all of the Windows settings so that you can set them all. We plan on having WinGet be aware of all of them so that it can go through and generate all of them and kind of spit them back out for you. But you look at that as a lot of data. Imagine what happens if I say, hey, WinGet configure export registry. That's not something that you want. So Steve and the PowerShell team have already been thinking about filtering and how you can pass filters in when you're doing that kind of an export, so that if you don't really care about all the registry keys, you're not going to get them. But if you do care about some of them, you'll have a way to inform the tooling which ones you're interested in so that we can get those back out again.
Dependencies for like this resource Microsoft Windows WinGet DSC, that was the thing you installed in the beginning, right?
So no, the question is, the resource on line 6, was that the thing I installed in the beginning? It's not. So that particular resource is the one that treats WinGet as a package manager in the world of DSC, and it understands get, set, and test. So when you say, in this case, I want to install the app installer, it's doing that based on that ID on line 12 as the WinGet package ID. I went ahead and specified the community source on line 13, but you could have specified the Microsoft Store, or you could have specified an enterprise source for WinGet that you stood up on your own. For this particular one, so in this case, in order to run WinGet configuration, you would have to have WinGet in the first place. So this is a contrived example, but let's say you had an earlier version, you went to go run this, it would know about the dependencies on UI XAML 2.8. If you were on an earlier version of WinGet, when we announced configuration like 1.6, this actually would have the ability to upgrade WinGet, pull in the dependencies that are coming from WinGet, and do the rest of that. But like I said earlier, if I'm generating an export off of the device, I would know I had the app installer. I would know that I had UI XAML. I would know that I had the VC runtime, but I wouldn't know that there's a particular order that I need to install them back in.
Okay.
Okay, so it did actually complete in the sandbox with a few minutes to spare. Give me a second, and I'll zoom this in. And of course, Control Plus is not working here.
No. It's the old one,
There we go. All right, so I've mapped a folder for the sandbox. And apparently that didn't want to line up. So that one failed on me. Sorry about that. So what I was going to show you is I've got a couple of configurations in the sandbox directory. There are also some additional samples. I'll go to them on the local system. So this full sandbox configuration, this is the one that I would have liked to have been able to use calling from WinGet in the package context. It's the one that requires running get WinGet configuration, passing the file to it, and then calling invoke. I'll go ahead and run that one now as an example. I'll go ahead and stop this sandbox. So this one is just going to spin up a plain sandbox. It doesn't have WinGet in it. This is the PowerShell syntax. We've had some people that have given us opinions that they would like to be able to call invoke directly without having to call get and pass that through. If that's something that matters to you, please go thumbs up the issue at GitHub. If you're fine with going through and doing all of the piping, let me know and I'll have the team work on something else. Hopefully some of those rough edges that we brought up before. You'll also see some differences in the way the PowerShell invoke works. It's intended to be a little bit more verbose, so you'll see the counters and the progress here. It's not the same as the WinGet CLI. If you don't want to see this output, if you've got a longer running one, we also have start WinGet configuration, which will basically start it as a background and give you context right back to the shell. But I more often use this one just to be able to see what's happening. You'll see that I got the result code of 0 and it's actually starting up the sandbox. So with that, I wanted to go ahead and open things up for questions. And I will bring up some web page examples for some of the configurations that we've got. So this one is a .files repository from Anthony in DevDev. And he's got several good samples in here, including one that I stumbled on today, that for those of you who like to use Chocolatey or you have that in the enterprise, you can use WinGet configuration and the CHoco-DSC resource to use Chocolatey as your package manager in a WinGet configuration. He also has a directory of .files, and I found this one with Oh My Posh. I reached out to Jan de Dobelier about building a DSC resource for Oh My Posh. You'll see that I love that prompt. But we'll have some fun challenges there, figuring out fonts, figuring out how to go modify our PowerShell profile. And I've been beating Steve up a little bit on when do I get a DSC resource for PowerShell so that I can go customize my PowerShell prompt. Another one here is Clint Rutkus. He is the product manager for PowerToys. And he and I have been going back and forth. We've been doing a lot of re-imaging our machines and trying to build configurations for WinGet to stand up a machine from scratch. We've been feeling all of the pain of mixed elevation, and there's no DSC resource out there that will go sort of start downloading all of my email from Outlook. So you'll see lots of interesting PowerShell scripting in here, and those are things we're treating as gaps in the product to go work on. I've got mine. It's probably in the worst shape out of the other ones. I keep breaking my bootstrapper script, but you'll see I've got the same thing as a user's configuration and an admin configuration. And I've just got a few examples in here. So you can clearly tell I'm not having a whole lot of success with this. So if you want me to keep doing on that, yell at me, let me know, and I'll go make that one public and spend some more time on it. And then if you look at the WinGet-DSC repository, if you go into resources, we've now open sourced all of the ones that we've built as examples for unblocking GitHub projects. And we're planning on going out and picking the top 5 or 10 projects across the top 5 or 10 programming languages to go build configurations for and find gaps for missing resources. If they're missing and we truly can't find them, we'll throw them in here. I expect we'll probably have to do a V2 resource that's class-based for files, because there is no file management since that's a binary resource. We've also need to put in some better examples around working with registry, and we'll probably need to do one to call dism.exe directly instead of trying to call the APIs, so that we'll have more success in those typical scenarios. All right, so I will open it up to any questions. How many of you have tried to build a WinGet configuration file or run one? Just a few of you. That's kind of what I expected. Anybody willing to share why they haven't yet? You didn't know it was there. How would you find out about something like this? Discoverability is truly a hard problem. You know, there's kind of a joke about Microsoft Word. We could probably stop developing on it, announce a new feature every single day, and probably not have to touch the code base for a year, and people would think that these are all new features. So I do stuff at, X and Stack Overflow and all the stuff at GitHub, and I do blogs. I do videos for Open at Microsoft, which is, short 8 to 12 minute videos. I plan on coming to this conference every year. This is a fantastic conference. Let me know what other things I can do to help you become aware of what we're doing. These are real challenges. Community calls?
Yeah, there you go. Just a 2-minute something update. Yeah. Would be, because it's within the boundary, in my opinion.
Yeah. Right. So community calls is a great recommendation. I'll join those. No questions is either really good or really bad. There we go. So the question is this supported on Windows Server? So I will tell you, WinGet is inbox in Server 25. Public previews are out. I did my first video with Pierre Roman, and I was shocked. I hadn't played with it. I just spun up a VM and just started messing with it. Everything worked, including configuration. I was absolutely thrilled. Your next question, I'm going to assume, is what about Server 22? What about Server 19? So I'm still in discussions with some of the teams. Everything works essentially flawlessly on Server 22. The real challenge there is there's no Microsoft Store by default, so there's no mechanism to upgrade or to service WinGet unless you stand up your own private repository or you trust the community repository to upgrade WinGet there. We will probably have some caveats. I would like to be able to go out with some kind of a support statement on Server 22, but I don't want to be on the hook to have to patch and fix everything for the next 10 years on that platform. That prevents me from kind of growing things forward. On Server 19, the main challenge there is there's no app execution alias. So if you just try to install it and try to run WinGet directly, no matter what you do, it's going to fail unless you go directly to the path where those files have been laid down. But if you use the PowerShell modules, it works just fine. I probably will not offer support on Server 19, but plenty of folks have figured it out. I think the other rough edge on server is if you're running server core, you need to have a locale specified in your WinGet settings, because we're using a shell API right now to get your locale, and without one, WinGet will fail. But a community member did figure that out, and it works just fine on server core.
So we're working on a pretty regulated industry, and we basically have to wait until the LTSC version of Windows 11 comes out. What about this upcoming version, Windows 11 LTSC 2024? What's doing?
So the question is about LTSC versions of Windows. WinGet is the plan going forward from here is that we will be in every new release that goes out. Generally, the mechanism for updating WinGet is through the Microsoft Store. We know that there are many air-gapped enterprise scenarios. That's why we are working on the download for Microsoft Store applications so that you can get both the packages that you need that are going to be the MSIX package from the store, including the license. You will need to log in, enter ID credentials so that we can generate the license for your correct domain. And we will also give you the dependencies, and you can specify the architecture that you want. So there are going to be air-gapped style solutions for maintaining and upgrading WinGet and its dependencies.
So is it plans to be able to do internal repositories?
So the question is about internal repositories. We actually built a reference implementation using REST that you can deploy to Azure. It's fairly heavyweight. It uses Cosmos DB as a backend. Each Azure subscription will allow you to have essentially one instance of the affordable or the free tier of Cosmos. So you can use that. There are some other commercial options that are out there if you search for them. We have been looking at the possibility of doing an Azure Marketplace offering. We've also been discussing with both the Microsoft DevBox and the Intune teams the possibility for them supporting an enterprise repository. And looking at enterprise governance, we plan on following suit with PowerShell to put the installers in Azure Container Registry. And we're actively working on intra-ID authentication to the reference implementation that we offer for the REST source. And that is one of our really big investments leading into the rest of this calendar year, is really closing those gaps on provenance for not only the applications, but the modules that you're running, and identifying any other areas of potential weakness or risk in policy and other areas of control. We know that enterprises want to be able to completely control what users can do, as well as exactly which versions of software end up on those devices.
Makes sense.
Is there a problem in enterprises where the store is blocked?
So the question is there a problem in enterprises where the store is blocked due to legal reasons or whatever? So from WinGet's point of view, the concept of sources, there can be one or more sources. You can disable through policy the store. And in that case, WinGet is not allowed to go talk to the store endpoint to install that content, which is totally fine. And if you want to offer store applications through your private source, you would use the WinGet download in a system that's not air-gapped, go through your SCIF or whatever your containment process is to validate the artifacts, bring those in, load those up on a private source. We will probably have to do a lot of work figuring out what kinds of sugar syntax you want in terms of PowerShell types of scripts or commandlets to do things like download the manifest, download the installers, modify that manifest so that it works to be able to pull the installers out of ACR, do all those publishing actions, and do it with the correct credentials. It's a really big landscape out there. We're going to try to pick one happy path and follow as many other teams and have them follow that same guidance so that at least we have an easy recommended path forward for you. But we're definitely going to need your feedback on that.
Is there a roadmap available that contains the ability to have internal sources?
Is there a roadmap for internal sources? So right now there's not one. We built the reference implementation to deploy on Azure early on. When we were partnering with Intune, we expected we were going to have to stand up a REST implementation, because if you're doing a portal-based mechanism, you need to be able to talk web APIs. You don't want to spin up an instance of WinGet in the user's browser or on the server to go download, a meg to 4 megs of index metadata to pull things out. We really haven't come to any final conclusions on that. We've been partnering with a couple of different organizations, some that are open source, some are commercial. What they're doing, honestly, is they're forking the WinGet packages repository, and they're using that as a mechanism to load up their own sources and using that to filter which applications they allow in. Right now, we're essentially assuming that you're probably going to need to build the least flexible model first, which is only the exact packages and the exact package versions that the enterprise wants. It's likely to be sort of manual and painful early on. Later on, we'll get into some more of what I would say are the convenience options, where you might have 10 or 20 or 30 applications in the community repository that you believe are trustworthy, where you can simply say, hey, when a new version shows up in the community repository, go ahead and pull it down, run whatever scans or automation you want on it to verify that package's safety and reliability requirements for your environment, and then pull them into your private source. But right now, we're not offering any sort of an on-premises type of a solution. I know there is one out there that's been implemented using a Docker container, and you can go search. I'm happy to have people put recommendations or referrals on any of our open source repositories, but I can't really endorse any of those other products, but they're absolutely out there. And I'm happy to talk with anybody that's interested in leveraging those kind of one-on-one, as well as anybody that's got some interest in building an implementation or something like that. I'm happy to kind of share our roadmap and what we're planning on doing so that it can maintain compatibility.
Will what's it called again? The export of will be platform, version or build independent. I mean, on service, on dependencies like UI, XAML, which is missing from servers, but which is present on clients. Will the dependency be recognized?
So the question is, how do we deal with dependencies that exist on server versus desktop when we're thinking about, I want to generate a configuration from one device and I want to go apply it on another? That is one of those quasi-intractable problems I mentioned earlier. We've got some ideas and we'll put out some public documentation on what we're thinking, and we'll build some samples. What I've run into is largely things work pretty smoothly until you want to get into something like spinning up IaaS or some of the other more heavyweight services or things that are not there. And definitely give us feedback on the ones that you're using so that as we move forward with Server 25, we're aware of those things and can start building some more conveniences in. But there are going to be some explicit gaps in functionality differences between client Windows and server Windows. And we may have to go in and throw in that assertion block where we assert that it's a client machine or a server machine. We may also need to build some utilities to take an export from desktop or server and apply whatever conversions we can to make it work in the other environment. But I don't think we want to try to be too smart there and do too much magic. The desire for what we've been doing with the declarative configuration file is we really want that file to be static, nothing dynamic happening, no branching logic, nothing conditional that's not just painfully obvious, like the dependency mapping for the graph of objects to be configured and the assertion block. And if any one assertion fails, we don't even want to run the configuration at all.
The dependencies are there, but dependencies are there for the application on desktop, but just not present on the server. So, you should be able to enumerate dependencies.
So the concern is that some of these dependencies exist on desktop or on server. And if we know that they're there, we should be able to enumerate them. And in many cases, it's possible to install them on the other version of the operating system. It's going to be some exploration before we figure out what the critical path scenario is for that and which ones we go invest in. I think right now, at least from my point of view, the biggest gaps I'm looking at is the challenges around mixed mode operation, where you want one configuration file, you want to be able to run it in system context and have it get that device as close to baked and finished as you can. And then only those things where a user has to be logged in and a user account has to be present, do you want to be able to run that? I would love to get some feedback on, do you see this world as I described it, where you want one file that works in these different contexts and we handle the reboot resilience and we do that? Or do you want to do something more like what we've at least seen internally with Microsoft DevBox, where one WinGet configuration runs in system context and does the bulk of the work? And then there's one that gets kicked off for the user that's specific to that user. And it also allows some additional customization. We know that in the developer world, developers have opinions about IDEs and key bindings and things like that. So they want to be able to run sort of optional configurations at the end to personalize that environment. And we know that also scares enterprises. So we're also thinking through, how can you go pre-validate a configuration file, make sure that we're not doing anything that violates policy, like trying to grab modules from the public PowerShell gallery or using resources that haven't been approved and made available in an ACR. Yes?
Can you also put JSON input as a config, or is it only YAML?
So the question is, can we take JSON input or is it only YAML? Right now, the thinking is these static configuration files are YAML. We had a lot of opinions early on with WinGet about it should be JSON or it should be YAML or it should be XML or we should support everything. Honestly, what we ran into was people only hand code these things for a fairly short period of time. They build tooling to generate them and to automate the processes. By the time you built tooling, it doesn't really matter. You just need a serialization format that works. I think the main reason that we've been leaning into YAML is because there's at least a perception that it's easier for a person to go through and read it. You don't get quite as confused with all the curly braces and commas and all of that. But I'll tell you, when I'm looking at it, I can't tell two spaces from four from the indentation. And since it is white space sensitive, I'm almost always having to open it up in an IDE myself.
Tooling is easy, and you have native support for JSON, and if you do a PowerShell module, then generates the config on the fly. So it would be easier to adopt automatically generated configuration from JSON.
So the statement is that since PowerShell does JSON natively, it would probably be easier to take, for example, the output from a PowerShell module or a script that is JSON and have that go into a configuration file. We will probably build some kind of a helper to go do that. We may go ahead and accept both JSON and YAML. From a coding point of view, it's not that big of a deal. I think more of the challenge right now has been how many samples are out there? Is there that strong of opinion? And honestly, we could probably build something fairly trivial that would just take that JSON output and serialize it as YAML in a file. I don't know if we need to deal with supporting multiple file formats. Sure, it's technically possible, but we don't really know how much value there is in going one way or the other. All right, looks like we're at time. Thanks, everybody. I will be around the conference for the rest of the week, and if you have any other questions, I'm happy to speak with you out in the hall.